Welcome to the second of the Parish of Chingford's Lent groups for 2023, in which we're looking at the ways in which the Passion of the Christ has been depicted in Western art over the last 800 years. Last week we looked at Stanley Spencer's The Last Supper, a picture painted just over 100 years ago, and moving on in the story of the last week of Christ's earthly life, this week we're looking at a work of art painted by the Italian artist Giotto da Bondone. It's tricky writing Giotto's biography. He was born in 1266 or 1267, certainly before 1276. He was born in the tiny little village of Vespignano. He was the son of a peasant. He was perhaps apprenticed to Cimabue, but all these things have to be followed by question marks, as most of our evidence is later or contested. About 1373, there was a rhymed version of a chronicle produced by Antonio Pucci, who was the town crier of Florence, who said that Giotto was 70 when he died, which implied that he would be born about 1266 or 1267. But Giorgio Vasari, who was a biographer of artists and whose biography of artists was published in 1550, gives the year 1276 as the year of Giotto's birth. Some legends reported by Vasari say that at the age of 11, whilst attending to his father's sheep, Giotto used to draw on the rocks with chalk, and Cimabue, who then was a prominent artist, saw him drawing a sheep so natural and so perfect. He immediately asked his father if he could bring Giotto with him and let him study art, and so Giotto's career started in Cimabue's studio. Vasari also said that when Giotto was only a boy with Cimabue, he once painted a fly on the nose of a face that Cimabue had drawn so naturally that the master, returning to his work, tried more than once to drive it away with his hand, thinking it was real. And I might tell you of many other jests played by Giotto, but of this is enough. Giotto's life is indelibly intertwined with the life of St. Francis, who was born in 1181, there or thereabouts, in Assisi in Tuscany, and died on the 3rd of October 1226. He was canonized very shortly afterwards in July 1221, and the very next day the Basilica at Assisi, as a memorial place for him, began to be built. This is a picture of the Basilica, and you can see it's a monumental building for the 13th century. So big that it contains an upper and a lower basilica. Two superimposed churches, one on top of the other. The first stone of the lower basilica was laid by Pope Gregory IX, the day after, as I said, Francis's canonization in July 1228. And 2 years later, his body, which had rested in the Church of San Giorgio, was brought in secret for fear of looting from tomb raiders and buried in the unfinished church. We don't know when the upper basilica, the works began there, but it must have been sometime after 1239, because it was on the order of Brother Elia, who had abdicated from the order. And both churches were consecrated by Pope Innocent IV in 1253. One of the challenges of telling Giotto's story entwined with the story of St. Francis and the Basilica there is, did Giotto paint these pictures? There is a huge amount of debate, which we're not going to go into, about whether it was Giotto or Cimabue or some unknown third party who painted the frescoes in the upper and the lower basilica at Assisi, which the upper basilica, of course, very badly damaged 20 years ago with an earthquake, and amazingly restored. The importance of St. Francis to Giotto is that, as in the words of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, Giotto demonstrates the urgent emotionalism of the Franciscan approach to Christianity, the urgent emotionalism, something which was new for the period. The painting that we're going to look at by Giotto today is to be found here in the so-called Arena Chapel in Padua. Bruce Cole, who wrote a wonderful biography of the Arena Chapel, says this: "A long street leads from the Piazza del Santo," that's the saint being Anthony of Padua, "in front of the basilica to the Scrovegni Chapel, sometimes called the Arena Chapel because of its location built on the site of a Roman amphitheatre. The chapel was probably completed by 1303 and was built by Enrico Scrovegni, one of Padua's best known and wealthiest citizens. His father, Reginaldo, had been condemned by Dante to the seventh circle of hell for his usurious practices. Enrico was probably a usurer as well. Wealthy and powerful, he also seems to have been viewed with disfavour. At least one of his contemporaries called him a hypocrite and a trickster. The chapel was built as a family chapel, and it immediately incited the anger and the envy of the neighbouring Remitani church. They complained that it was far too big to be a private chapel, and its staffing was too big to be a private family chapel. It had 3 priests and a provost. And the monks were right to complain, for as soon as it opened, pilgrims flocked there. One of the reasons why pilgrims flocked to the chapel was that Enrico had a very good friend who just happened to be Pope Benedict XI, and he issued a papal bull granting indulgences to pilgrims to Enrico's chapel. Those who, having confessed and being fully penitent, shall solemnly visit the aforementioned church on the feast of the Nativity, of the Purification, of the Assumption of the Virgin, will be granted a dispensation of 1 year and 40 days, that is, from purgatory. And for those who shall solemnly visit the church for 1 week immediately following the feast days, we mercifully give dispensation of 100 days from the injunction of penance." In the chapel, we see a portrait of Enrico as he donates the chapel that he has had built to the Three Marys. It's a closely realised portrait of the real person. He would have been recognised from this. He's supported in presenting the model of the chapel to the Three Marys by a cleric whose robe, if you'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, hangs over the real architecture of the archway. Giotto is attempting, by means of this illusion and the realistic depiction of the donor, to draw the viewers into the picture. This is real, he is saying, and as real as anything that you see in the world around you. Now, the chapel might be too big to be a proper family chapel, but it is still a small building, only 21 metres long by 8.5 metres wide by 12.8 metres, almost 13 metres tall, lit by 5 lancet windows set into the southern wall, which we can see on the right-hand side of the building there. That's 68 feet by 27.5 feet by 42 feet high. As Bruce Cole says, when one enters the Scrovegni chapel, the effect is overwhelming and uplifting. The initial impression is of a space entirely filled with light, colour and form. A sense of restful well-being seems to fill the room. The spectator has stepped into a harmonious, balanced work of art where no area calls attention to itself. The eye wanders happily and unimpeded across the chapel's walls. This experience results from Giotto's astute understanding of fresco as decoration and as a type of painting whose first function is to cover space evenly with harmonious shape and colour. Although it's a harmonious and balanced work of art, that doesn't mean that there isn't a pattern to it as well. The frescoes are arranged to tell a story. It begins with the expulsion of Joachim and Anna, the parents of the Blessed Virgin Mary, from the temple to the Last Judgment, arranged in 3 registers, 3 different layers around the walls. And to understand the entire sequence of events, says Cole, one must turn in space to follow the course of the downward spiral of episodes from wall to wall. Viewing the path of the narrative of the Scrovegni Chapel demands, like most other works of art, active physical participation. It is, in effect, the most closely familiar form of art in the 21st century would be a comic book, a graphic novel, a cartoon. as it were. Not quite the sense of the cartoon in the Peter Cook and Dudley Moore sketch, but it tells a story using images. Where Giotto got the idea from which scenes to illustrate is probably taken from a work called Meditations on the Life of Christ by Pseudo Bonaventure. It used to be thought that this was written by Saint Bonaventure, who was one of Saint Francis's first followers, but it's apparent that it was written after Bonaventure's time, and it was probably written about 1300, roughly at the same time that Scriveni was wanting his chapel to be painted. Dating from the end of the 13th century, the Meditations is a lively compilation of stories about Christ's life. Filled with much colour and anecdotal detail, it's written with admirable clarity and directness. The reader is asked to participate in the holy events as though present. The Meditations must have appealed especially to Giotto, whose approach to religious subject matter was always supremely humane and direct. Let's have a look at a few examples before we get on to our picture for today. This is scene number 28, the scenes from the life of Christ, Judas's betrayal. The fresco is about 1.5 meters by 1.4 meters square. It's very seldom depicted, the betrayal of Judas, but it is on the triumphal wall arch, so it's the one that you look at as you're looking east. From the preceding scene, the scribes who were whispering in the driving of the traders from the temple are now here persuading Judas to betray his master. Judas, dressed in his gold cloak, of which more in a minute, with the devil at his back, holding a sack of gold, exchanges a knowing glance with the Pharisee. We are in the presence of wicked men. The very next scene, which we saw briefly last week, is the Last Supper, with Judas, again, identifiable by his gold cloak in the bottom left-hand corner of the fresco. Immediately after that, it's the washing of the feet, taking place in an open room, in the same room that the Last Supper was depicted. You can see how the practicality of washing feet is being depicted here. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's one disciple putting his sandals back on, another one scratching his foot, Peter gathering up his robe, the bottom right-hand corner, to prevent it getting wet. And as well as having all these little details, Giotto makes sure that the centre of the story is in the glances exchanged between Christ and Peter. Peter putting his hand to his head, unable to believe what it is that the Lord is telling him. So we come on to our painting for today. It's the 31st of the frescoes, and from the life of Christ, the arrest of Christ, sometimes called the Kiss of Judas. This one's slightly larger than the first fresco we saw. It's about 2 meters by 1.85 meters square. 6.5 feet by 6 feet. It is night, a significant identifying mark in John's Gospel. Torches are shining out from amongst the sticks and the halberds against the blue of the sky. So Giotto fills the lower 2/3 with action. The upper third is the night sky, and the sticks, the weapons and the lanterns of the arresting soldiers filling that space. Throngs of people crowding to the centre towards Christ, who is identified and betrayed by Judas's kiss. Every movement, even that of Peter as he cuts off the ear of an attacker, every gaze heightens the tension of the central confrontation. Giotto is the master of the knowing look. Judas's cloak, which we have seen him wear, presses against Christ, who seems to disappear beneath the traitor's cloak. It's almost as if Judas's cloak is swallowing up Jesus, that Jesus is being swallowed up by the malevolence of evil. Surrounded and hemmed in by numerous faces, the profiles of Christ and Judas almost collide. The two look at one another, one with dignity and seriousness, the other full of malice. The whole drama of the event is captured in this glance between the two of them. You can see what the commentators mean by the humanity of Giotto and his realism when you compare the arrest of Christ's Kiss of Judas from a earlier artist. This is the arrest from the apron of a 13th century crucifix, so from within 100 years beforehand. Alan Farber says about this, while corresponding in many details with Giotto's, including the Kiss of Judas and St. Peter's rash response in the cutting off of the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest, these images are clearly worlds apart. Giotto has transformed the weightless, puppet-like figures of the earlier work into truly monumental figures who appear to convincingly occupy space. This is part of Giotto's purpose to make the characters that he is painting, the story that he is telling, appear to be physically and emotionally present to the viewer. Part of what the Encyclopaedia Britannica has called the urgent emotionalism of Franciscan approach to Christianity. This is the depiction of the betrayal of Christ from Matthew's Gospel. Matthew 26, 47 to 56. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man, arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scripture be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way?" At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a bandit? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. At the centre of the depiction, says Alan Farber, is the face-to-face confrontation of Judas and Christ. Judas's sinister and animalistic embrace is met with an all-knowing expression of absolute forgiveness. Bruce Cole says this is the moment after the kiss. Stillness at the centre of the maelstrom. Christ's body is nearly obliterated by the golden robe worn by Judas. And Bruce Cole says that Judas is withdrawing from the kiss, realising for the first moment the enormity of his wickedness. Is Judas's cloak gold or yellow? Diane Apostolos Capodona, in her Dictionary of Christian Art, talks about the significance of the colour yellow. It's a colour with two opposite symbolic meanings, dependent upon the context. In its primary meaning, yellow was an element of the sun and suggested divinity. Yellow signified illuminated truth, that is, the truth removed from the shadows. The gold and yellow background of Byzantine and Renaissance paintings symbolised the sacredness of space. Joseph of Nazareth and Peter both wore yellow as a symbol of revealed truth. However, yellow could also be denoting infernal light, degradation, jealousy, treason, cowardice, instability and deceit, such as when Judas Iscariot wore yellow. Medieval heretics and non-believers wore yellow garments, while yellow crosses denoted the contagious areas during the plagues, and in the medieval ghetto, the Jews were required to wear yellow badges. We see here a connection between the customs of Giotto's time, the late 13th and early 14th century, and what happened in the 20th century. That yellow becomes the symbol of wicked Jewishness, and it was yellow Star of David that the Jews were required to wear under the Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany. In this way, the only Jew in Jesus' disciples becomes Judas Iscariot. It's important for us to realise the point that Bruce Cole makes right at the very beginning, that this is a sequence of frescoes to be read as a whole, to be appreciated in situ, rather than doing as we're doing, looking at them individually on a screen or looking at them in a book. Giotto was very aware of the relationships of adjacent images and how particular themes can be picked out in the fresco cycle. So, for example, there are two incidents in the story of Christ in adjacent scenes on the south wall. We have the presentation of the infant Christ into the temple, and the betrayal of Christ is immediately below. So here we see the presentation, Candlemas, the infant Christ taken into the arms of Simeon, and the Nunc Dimittis being spontaneously sung for the first time. And immediately below is the betrayal of Judas. Here's a fake mock-up of how those two images look together. Look closely at the way that Giotto has painted the two central characters in each scene. There is the infant Christ looking into the eyes of Simeon, and there is the adult Christ looking into the eyes of Judas. Now, Lord, you let your servant depart in guilt. His eyes have seen the wickedness of his actions. Thinking of Giotto's humane and realistic portrayal of people, he's bringing out here the emotional response of the high priest, whose harsh vengeance is suddenly checked, as Alan Faber says, by his sudden realization of Christ's true nature. Is this a moment of epiphany for the high priest? Think about the way in which in the scriptures and in Giotto's painting that Christ accepts his betrayal, and compare and contrast that with Peter's violent attack on Malchus. For the first time, holy figures are depicted with all the strengths and frailties of the worshipper. Christ, his mother, his followers, and sometimes his enemies are in many ways each of us. No longer symbolic abstractions, they are men and women with real, often conflicting human emotions, who, through their tribulations and triumphs, convey a luminous and eternal message of abiding hope. Mentioned earlier on the meditation, Meditations on the Life of Christ by Pseudo Bonaventure. This is what he wrote about the betrayal of Christ. Even as he spoke, that wicked man Judas, most evil merchant, came before the others and kissed him. It is said to have been the custom of the Lord Jesus to receive disciples he had sent out with a kiss on their return. Therefore the traitor gave the kiss as the sign. Preceding the others, he returned with a kiss, almost as though to say, I have not come with these soldiers, but returning, I kiss you according to custom and say, Ave, Rabbi, God save you, Master. O real traitor, pay careful attention and follow the Lord as he patiently and benignly receives the treacherous embraces and kisses of that wretch whose feet he had washed but a short time before, and to whom he had given the supreme food. How patiently he allows himself to be captured, tied, beaten, and furiously driven, as though he were an evildoer and indeed powerless to defend himself. How he even pities his fleeing and errant disciples. And see also their grief, as unnerved, sorrowfully weeping, and lamenting like orphans, and frightened by fear they leave, and their sorrows go greater as they see their Lord so miserably led away. There's an interesting detail in Peter's interaction with Malchus. You can see there that Peter, in this sort of olive green and salmon pink robe, with his right arm extended out, with the sword, with the dagger cutting off Malchus's ear. You can see that there is a hooded figure whom we don't recognise. We don't know who he is, for his face is hidden. And some commentators have pointed out that this is a reference to the passage in John's Gospel of the post-resurrection appearances of Christ, where Christ teaches his disciples the consequences of being a follower of his, from John 21 verses 18 to 19. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wish. But when you grow old you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this he said to him, "Follow me." The disciples are being held, they're being compelled physically for things happening to them that they don't want to have happen. And in this way, although Giotto is depicting real people in real space, having real emotions, he's also collapsing and compressing time. This is a foreshadowing, not just of Jesus' death, but of the martyrdom of Peter and the rest of the apostles as well. One final story about Giotto. According to one story, Pope Benedict IX wanted to employ Giotto and sent an emissary to visit the artist. The messenger asked Giotto for a drawing he could submit to the Pope to prove the artist's worth. Giotto smiled and took a sheet of paper, dipped his brush in red paint, closed his arm to his side, and with one twist of his wrist he drew a perfect circle freehand. Giotto handed this drawing to the messenger, who stared back in disbelief. "Is this the only drawing I'm to have?" asked the messenger. Giotto answered, "It's more than enough. Send it along and you'll see whether it's understood." So the arrest of Christ through the betrayal of Judas. Next week we move on in our story, and we move on 300 years in time by looking. We don't have to go to Padua for this, we can go to the National Gallery. Gerrit von Honthorst's Christ before the High Priest. Come back next week and share in this part of our story of the Passion of Christ in Western art.